welcome back, folks, to episode 6 of the Running Man Self-Regulation Skills and Self-Improvement Project podcast with your host, Armando Dominguez, PhD in Health Psychology, licensed counselor, and also adjunct professor at a local community college. Now, we're going to talk today about anger. Anger is a rather touchy topic for many, but it's something that in living a human life, most of us have experienced it directly in ourselves or seen someone else being angry. And maybe we've even seen our children, babies, get angry and upset. We realize it's a very natural human thing. But in the context of the anger that we're going to be talking about today, we're going to be discussing the state of anger. Also, well, what does my thinking look like? And I said look on purpose. In quotes, I'm flexing my air quotes. You can't see me because I'm on audio. But when I say look, that's kind of a reflection of what type of thinking we may be having that tends to lend itself to the visual mind, also the imaginal or imagination, imaginal being the scientific term used for studies of the use of imagination and studying daydreaming and stuff that falls within the realm of mental picture things. But whenever we look at the nature of our thinking when we're angry, this will come to make more sense as we move along today. Now, anger, whenever we experience it, is a physiological state. And one thing that we know is that when we experience anger, we rarely feel anger in and of itself as a discrete emotion by itself. In most studies and reasonable books on how to manage anger and how to manage your emotion, identifying emotion, and working through things of that nature, we understand that anger is called a secondary emotion, meaning generally it's preceded by or coupled with another emotion such as shame, embarrassment, fear of judgment. Often there's this idea of fear of loss, whatever that loss could be. It can vary person to person. It could be material loss, could be loss of a loved one. It could be loss of respect in the eyes of certain people that may be esteemed or that have some sort of leverage or authority over our lives or earnings, and that's a very personal thing, especially in this modern day and age. But when we have anger, we have to recognize that what we've been discussing in the first 5 of the podcast episodes has to do with the arousal of the physiological body, in the sense that our heart rate goes up when we stress. Anger is a stress. It's a distress versus eustress. Eustress being one of those things that we like doing, like jumping in the bouncy house or dancing or doing something fun like BMX, if you're into that sort of thing. That raises heart rate, but that's exhilarating. There's a difference. But when we're in a state of distress, this is where we start noting some differences in how our body responds in the state of anger. Anger tends to be very focal in the sense that we have it directed in most cases towards something that's happening, or it arises as a result of something that's being spoken to us that maybe is offensive, or maybe we're in an environment that is physically challenging or possibly threatening, or could be feeling like it's threatening. Now, those are a lot of variables right there. But often it doesn't always take a whole mess of complicated variables to get somebody to the point of anger to where they may act. Anger is one of the things that we share with animals, that whenever we feel that, adrenaline kicks in and our emergency stores cook off, especially when we're in starvation mode and we get kind of grouchy and really focused on just the food. We don't make really good conversation there. We tend to be a little short and snappish with people, and we tend to growl if we're of the four-legged creature type nature, but we're not as sociable because we're very focused on getting the next meal. That's what drives it. Notice I said meal. This also indicates being hungry, a state of body that if it goes far enough, we tend to feel that irritability. It can lead to anger very quickly. Now, from years of working with folks that struggle with addictions, and not just with substances, but rather behavioral addictions, anything like gambling addiction, sex addiction, internet addiction, shopping addiction, things along the lines of substances as well. We have to recognize that there's a component of anger often when somebody stops those behaviors. Whenever there's a limitation on that dopamine that we seek, then we get kind of dopamine drunk in a sense, in that we know how to get that, how to get the payoff, and we enter the back door, so to speak. So we put the cart before the horse, and therefore the cart is not moving because the horse is wondering, well, why am I not in front? Well, part of it is because we found the shortcut. We found our way to the back of the cart, realizes that where the payoff is, why do I need the horse? So, in that sense, there's another thing that I just dropped right now, and that was a metaphor of sorts, a little narrative, a story, based in picture words, making it sound like our mind and our dopamine process had to do with the cart and the horse, and it doesn't. But these are some of the things that I'm trying to illuminate, so that way we can understand how we become very sensitive to offense. When we're angry, we tend to be more suggestible, but also more apt to believe what we see, not just externally, but also what we see in our mind, that is brought up by the words that people speak to us whenever we're in a state of vigilance or hypervigilance at the most extreme. So everything that I'm telling you may sound like it's madness, but it is methodical madness, and I'm going to make sense of it. And we will bring this all tied together at the end of this podcast, and it'll make good sense. And you'll have a greater understanding of what's up with anger and with other things that we've talked about up until now, but also how we can start using what we know as understanding of how we respond as a tool to help minimize angry states that might derail us or cause us harm, discomfort, or disruption of what we call our life. So from this point, I'll be moving forward in a stepwise sense, and we're going to clarify some things. And the stuff that I mentioned to you just moments ago will make a whole lot more sense. And you'll have something with you that, even if you don't listen to this podcast ever again, or if there's anyone that knows me that never sees my mug again, I say that jokingly, you will take something with you that'll never stop serving you. That's my goal. So we're going to get moving at this point. As far as anger goes, whenever we have anger, often we have tension. When we have tension, that means that we have muscular tightness. That means we clench up often. You might see people, body language wise, do pay attention to the body language, tense up. They will ball up their fists, their face will get scrunched, they might get tense in their neck and jut their chin forward, and you might notice their shoulders hunching forward and their tailbone tucks, and then their knees bend almost like they're getting crouched to get ready to pounce. And it's essentially what it is. When we start seeing those symptoms, even if we're just having an argument with somebody, there is a component of potential physical activity that could occur. So someone is getting poised and ready for action if they need to. So even though you may not be arguing with the sense of trying to get into a physical fight, and they may not have thought about getting into a physical fight as a result of whatever type of argument you may be in, the body, depending on how abrupt and how loud it gets and how the body language is, may respond in a sense that is very mirroring of what it sees. It being your body, it being what you're perceiving through your eyes. And this is before it even goes through the filter of what we call ego. This is at the perceptual level. We're talking about 150 to 300 milliseconds where the presentation is telling your body, fight, flight, move away from it. This is dangerous, or move closer because that looks like food, or that's a friend. And if you're angry, probably not the it's a friend part. And there's probably a need for distance, but also there's this sense of intimidation that may come in. And this is where real estate starts to get close, and people may want to close a distance, which is not a good idea, especially if we take into consideration what we discussed in the second episode, where we discussed the blood flow leaving the front part of our brain. That means our higher cognition is now short-circuiting because I don't have enough fuel to think with my best and highest level of cognition, reasoning, and rationale at that point in time, especially if it's all of a sudden. And if something moves faster than 150 milliseconds, we no longer have the opportunity to decide approach avoid. Now it's avoid only, and we're going to default. Consider it a threat. Default. That means everything that comes forward, whether it be a soft little bunny moving at 100 faster than 100 milliseconds, but with every intent of hugging you, versus something that's like a wolf that has teeth and it's at faster than 100 milliseconds and it does intend to bite you. The bunny and the wolf, well, they're both going to be considered a threat, and you're going to want to move away. And that's where we see a lot of startle things happening. The startle reflex is known as motor reflex in the body, and we see that in babies. And we think that evolutionarily that's something that may have kept a predator. If there were something trying to eat an infant, then it startled, that shaking might have scared something away and keeping it from getting its meal. So we have startle responses occurring when things move too fast. If things get very big from a very small position in our horizon, that's called looming. And when things get bigger, all of a sudden our body naturally starts responding to that speed of onset of whatever it is that's coming at us. And we don't know what it is in many cases. We just know it's there, and we're trying not to be there when it comes. Now, whenever we have anger, and this isn't always just in an argumentative sense, we have heart rate go up, breathing changes. Also, the blood flow in our ears tends to go away. That means the little bones in our ears don't transmit sound as well. The little bones are called the ossicles. And you know those three little bones, the little stirrup and the anvil hammer thing that we always hear uh, about whenever we're in elementary school biology, are trying to transmit sound, but they can't. Um, we lose some of our acuity because of that lack of blood flow. We lose some of our fine motor skill on our vocal cords. That means our voice gets a little louder, might sound abrupt, maybe a little offensive and irritating to somebody. And as our body is needing to push more air, as if whenever we're running, notice I keep saying as if because there should be something called running occurring, but somehow we have this social contract that says we're not supposed to run or get away. And that catch-22 can make us very uncomfortable, but yet we're still in a state that is probably more amenable to moving away and running quickly. So whenever we're in those states, these things happen all of a sudden. Blood flow goes to the muscles, we get a lot stronger. Blood flow leaves the front part of the brain, and we get a little bit dumber, about 10 to 14 IQ points drop. So that's 10 to 14%. It is just an average stress. Once again, if it's terror, fright, or pain, it can drop up to 30%, and then we really have a hard time thinking. We can see and think what it is that we're trying to do, but we can't choose or pick. And we definitely can't articulate verbally very well what it is we're trying to say without sounding like we're shouting. And this is often whenever our mind becomes very binary, black, white, up, down, concrete, in the sense that even our words, when we're talking to somebody, becomes the FU or this or that or whatever, and it's your mom or your dad or this or that. Very monosyllabic, very simple terminology, because we can't really generate for a time much more than that. So these are things that happen all at once. These aren't things that happen in any particular order per se. Now, we have to know that they happen, and this is some of the complication factor when we stress, when we have anxiety, when we have pain, and whenever we have anger and fear. These things occur. And the importance I place on this is very important in the sense that once you understand it, then you can use that symptomology to help regulate yourself. Even if you're going to go do counseling with somebody, if you don't have these things in order, you're not going to do really good counseling. You're not going to do really good talk. And you're not going to get a whole lot of therapy as a result, because your capacity to understand is marginalized. So by learning how to do these things first, and this isn't just about going to therapy, this is about just having better quality of life with less stress in your life. So you have higher quantities of higher quality things in your life, your relationships, and you can enjoy them better. And you can prevent things from going too far or getting out of hand or feeling like they're out of control. So the next part of this is whenever we have anger, once again, stress goes up. But also there is the difference in the way we think. We think very simply. We not only are unable to speak very well, we also have our muscles that by default, not by choice, and you can't unchoose this. You kind of have to ride it out. You get stronger because the blood flow goes there, because you should be moving. What this is indicating that most people don't understand is that the language of the body is motion. The very first language we speak is movement. We can't see very well when we're born. We can't get up and run, but we can move. We can wiggle. When we're in utero, we move. Whenever the body feels stressed and our environmental assumption of safety is not met, meaning I feel somehow vulnerable or unsafe wherever I'm at, movement is key. Movement is also the salve or the cure for what it is that ails me. And what's ailing me is the stress of feeling unsafe. And how do I move? Well, one of the best things, if you're capable of walking, is to walk away. Once you start feeling it come up, especially if it comes up really fast, if you start feeling the symptoms of it, pay attention and honor what it is your body is speaking to you. Let it tell you, let's not be here, this is uncomfortable. And if you have the chance, say, hey, can we come back and talk about this in a little bit? I'm not feeling really good. Or I'll be back in a minute and we'll come back and talk about this. That strategically is cognitive behavioral therapy type stuff, wherever your best thinking should be able to derail things. But what if you can't get away from your environment? What do you do then? Episode 5, the one that we just released this past week, is the breathing method, the 4 count. This is one event that if you can't get away or you're stuck because of social concerns, or you have your kids there, or you're bound because you're responsible for being there, but yet it's not something that's threatening your body or harm, but yet it's stressful or anxiety inducing. Using the 4 count breath, the square breath, is something that you could do now. And you don't have to tell anybody you're doing it, but this is basically a scenario where it would work. I've used it in situations like this before. I've also taught it to people that have used it in situations very similar, and some that were verging on violence, and it worked really well. This also works for people that have anxiety and panic frequently. By learning how to use that technique, it helps us manage what we call anger much more quickly, and it helps to alleviate some of the pressure we feel. Because here's the second part of the anger, not just the physiological things, but the detail I want you to remember is that our breathing changes when we're angry. We tend to be dynamic breathers. I'm going to kind of mind this a little bit, so if it sounds a little huffy, I'm doing this on purpose. Whenever somebody is breathing dynamically, one might hear, or someone is actually sucking wind and you can actually hear it almost raspy going in and out. Or you may hear somebody doing what's called a bellows breath, where it's almost like a huffing, deep, well, jokingly, the heavy breathing on the other end of the phone that people usually talk about. But when somebody does that, one is waking up the sympathetic nervous system. And that's part 2 of this. Part 3 is this, is that even if you're not in an event or situation with other people that are irritating or angering to you or of you, you can make yourself angry all by yourself. Just like anxiety can be brought on by thoughts, anger can be brought on by thoughts. But also anger is interesting in this way, in that you don't have to have a reason to be angry, but if you start emulating the behavior aspect of anger, you crouch over, get your tense muscles, then you start doing the heavy breathing over and over. You start generating a state of anger without a focal point. You don't have a blame. But if somebody jumps in the middle of it, you will find a reason to be mad at them and sound grouchy at them. And you'd be more apt to act out or yell at them or whatever. Because we have basically moved our blood flow away from our brain, even though we've intended to do this, and into our muscles we've gotten stronger, and then we've gotten ourselves prepared for action. Not unlike the breath of fire that they do in yoga, that actually awakens you. But whenever we do this in the typical standing, in the social paradigm where I'm on my feet or around people, you can make yourself angry. And then our body tends to be convinced, especially if somebody responds to us and scowls at us, all of a sudden we become very self-centric. This is part 4 of the anger that I want you to pay attention to. Our mind shift. We tend to be much more suggestible, and more apt to make narrative, to make sense of stuff that we see out there, because it feels like people are looking at us. But not only that, whatever they're thinking, we're assuming to be about us. And that makes us just more angry. We've found somebody to blame. We have a reason to blame now. So we have 4 aspects of anger. 1, you can make yourself angry. 2, you have the heart rate go up, breathing changes, and the blood flow shifts from the brain, and we become a little simpler, but also it goes to the muscles, we get stronger. And in addition to that, we can make ourselves angry without a target. So it is a state of body if we don't have a preceding emotion to go with it, which means we can probably stop it at that point a little more easily than if we have shame or sense of loss or fear of judgment, this sort of thing that may actually be occurring outside of us. Now, some other things about anger that often are taught is what we will call thinking processes or cognitive processes, and those things are okay, but they don't work really well when you're angry. And most of the folks that teach this from the perspective of I am assumed, their assumption of safety is met in their mind, that they're assumed safe, their environment is not threatening, and we're talking about things that are high stakes from a distance, like a third person observer. So if I were speaking to somebody that had an episode of anger that they wound up getting destructive and breaking their cell phone, this sort of thing, we're talking about it as a past tense, past event. We may discuss it as a future event, but we're not discussing it from the perspective of right now. So it's easy to make good strategic plans to not do this next time, and these are absolutely useful. But also they're absolutely useless if you don't practice them. So that's why we do them beforehand. That's why we strategize for the next time. And remember the last time and how that came out, which gives us motivation to learn this stuff now. So that way we can prevent it then. So the premise is sound, it's appropriate. But the problem is, if you read books on this or you talk to people, most people, if they've never been in a situation that was tense, angry, or wherever they thought that they were threatened, or if they made it and came back out of it somehow, without that reference, then in most cases it's just largely academic. Which means I read it in a book, or somebody told me, and I'm taking it on their good authority, and I'm saying this with a little bit of disdain, but at the same time with the greatest deal of respect, because they're useful tools, but they must be practiced. Most people do proscribe practice, yes. Repetition is what builds reflex over time. Well, second nature, close to reflex. And whenever we have these skills, when do they work best? When you catch things early, when you catch anger early, when you catch the change in thinking that is being preceded by the beginnings of the emotion, not when it's overwhelming and out of hand, because at that point, then you have to do behavioral things. That means don't be there. Walk away. Run away if you must. And don't be talking and thinking, because you'll be outsmarted, irritated, at some point probably insulted if you're trying to do this against the grain of what your body is doing right now. Not the wisest of things. So what are we going to do when we get angry? 1 is try to catch it early. 2, recognize that resilience, by way of doing exercise if you can, doing some walking, doing something that varies your heart rate, is very helpful. Heart rate variability allows your body to adjust to stress and then go back down to normal. Now, this is a confound here, because if we have chronic stress, that means our heart rate is generally always stressed and doesn't really come all the way down until the next stress pops up. And modern life can be that way sometimes. And sometimes we have those days, it's like, man, when's it going to stop? And something else pops up. When we have chronic stress, then our body conditions to that over a long enough period of time. This is where we start seeing hypercortisolism, where we start seeing an increase of inflammation in the body, increase in weight, increasing incidence of heart rate issues, cardiac arrest, respiratory arrest, and panic issues, anxiety issues, and we start seeing increases in even uh, autoimmune dysfunction such as asthma, things of this nature. And the variability that I was talking about that comes from exercise teaches our body to deal with the spike in stress, and then all of a sudden it goes back down. It allows us to condition down and realize, okay, it's going to be over sometime. And that's not really based on faith or belief. When we have a chronicity of stress, it's almost like we're predicting it and expecting it, so therefore we're allowing ourselves to be always kind of half prepared and always kind of preventing ourselves from relaxing and getting to that state of comfort that I will put in quotes by calling vulnerability. The most vulnerable state being sleep, and sleep tends to be the most disrupted, it seems, when we have high stresses. Sleep is one of the first things that get disrupted in our life. Sleep time is the most vulnerable time that we have, in the sense that physiologically we're rested, but if we're expecting the shoe to drop or the stress to come around that corner here in just a moment, then we never really rest fully, and we're always going to be at marginal levels of recovery and not as healthy over time. What does that have to do with anger? It has to do a lot with anger. Because anger is one of the things that helps us survive best. Whenever we're cave people, that emotion of anger helped us drive and motivate to do and make change. It was always about violence. Anger can be experienced and not be violent. But anger also is a component of getting things done. This is not in the vein of the grinding it out and being more productive that we see in our modern times now. Starting your own business, you got to grind. That means that you're always angry. That is a rhetorical question. And I would say no. But there is a tension and a quality that does go with that. We tend to misunderstand and think that we have to always be angry somehow to survive better. And it is very closely tied. And this is where a good meditation practice, learning how to breathe appropriately, wherever you're calm and safe, and then doing deep breathing. Not necessarily trying to do deep breathing when you're angry, because that will just make you more huffy and angrier. That wouldn't be the good time to do that. But the 4-count breath, the short hiatus breath that I taught in episode 5, is appropriate for whenever we are angry. Now, movement, once again, is the first language of the body. And movement is the language that we speak by not words, but by the movements that we take to alleviate the tension. But it also suggests to our body, it speaks to our body the language it speaks, saying that if there is anger and upset somewhere, that we're able to leave that environment. That means I'm able to avoid consequence and circumstance. Knowing that, even no one speaking it to us, but us seeing ourselves, leaving, walking away, is a survival orientation. It also tells you, hey, I'm getting away from this. I survive, therefore I thrive, and I win. Not points on the scoreboard, but rather above ground suck and win. I'm still here. Winning in that sense. Winning in the sense that I have managed my stress, and I've overcome that, and it's not a competition, and I win once again over someone else, but rather you gain the opportunity to breathe well, rest well, recover, and return back to those things such as relationships, family, and opportunities, whether it be work or doing things that are important to you. Now, one of the things that drives us is a thing called the hedonic response, and hedonism, not the religious sense, but rather the hedonism of being human, has to do with us pursuing those things that feel good, that taste good, that give us that payoff that say, hey, I'm alive. Whenever you eat a piece of fatty meat that's very satiating, we tend to have that relaxation feeling. But whenever you have that cool drink in the hot summer that cools your core, you have that relief. Or whenever you jump in a cool pool after being out in the heat during the summer, once again, that relief is that sense of satiating payoff. and there is definitely a release of dopamine that goes on with that. Now, whenever we have this hedonic response, we are looking at two things. One is that whatever we consider fearful, angry, upset, anxious, panicky, even irritable, what is it that's driving it and what's the point of it? It's not a thought process where I'm thinking I have to act this way to get what I want or to get a result. These are physiological states that are resulting from our environment stressing us in a way that we feel that. And then the thinking comes fractions of a moment later. 1.2 seconds is 400 times slower than that aspect of us that responds in feels and shaking and anger. Whenever we hear about animals surviving stress, people say, well, they're animals, they're much more resilient. Well, they kind of have to be. Whenever an animal experiences a very traumatic situation, and Dr. Robert Sapolsky, an amazing neuroanatomist and awesome lectures to listen to from Stanford, that if you look up on YouTube, you'll be amazed and fully educated. The man is Haas in the truest sense. And Dr. Joseph Ledoux, his book Emotional Brain, many years ago came out. And one of my professors had turned me on to his work, and I really enjoyed that. But these two gentlemen, lots of research in areas having to do with how animals respond and the correlation of how humans respond under stress, not so different. But whenever animals get preyed upon and they survive, their adrenaline response, how do they shake it off and then go on without the negative effects? Well, they shake. They tremble. They have tremor in their body. They're literally shivering like they're cold. Animals shake it off and then they move along. Humans do that to a degree, but they don't shake it off completely because whatever signal we have splits off and goes to our higher cortex, and we start reliving and we start to rethink. We start to do what's called ruminating on things. We start remembering things and focusing on things within the experience that are different than the way we experience them because we hyper focus on them. And they're similar enough that it will bring back that response that starts resembling what sounds like post-traumatic stress reactivity or even up to PTSD level, disorder level. So these are some very real physiological things that even in anger, we tend to experience such things. Now, the point of anger often is about control and getting what I want, right? Don't agree to that. No, it's about survival first. Now, there are some that learn the behavior of anger to be able to manipulate and control. And that's not exactly what we're discussing today, but just something to keep in mind to put things in context that sometimes we learn how to use anger instrumentally. One of the things that we have to keep in mind about anger, too, is that if we have a chronic enough repetition of events that we use anger in, we become very practiced at it. We become skilled. And if we become skilled at something, that means that at some point we become very competent at it. Therefore, along the lines of the learn and competency scale, we start off with unconscious incompetence, meaning I don't know what I'm doing and I don't know what's happening. I have no skill in it. I'm not aware of it. We can get angry and whoop, by surprise like a baby. They don't know what's going on. But the older we get, we become more aware of it. We become conscious of it, but we're incompetent in the sense we can't control it. Then we get to a level of now I know what's happening and I can shuttle this or move this in a direction that is useful to me, instrumentalism. And now it is what? Me becoming consciously competent. I've gained some skill. Maybe I don't have all control, but I have some control of it. And now I can use it to get my way. And this is what we start seeing children that become entitled and adults that grow up and never decide to sophisticate their tools. And there are some that can't because their environments, of course, I'm making a bit of fun, but there are some that have no choice in the matter. And then we have this level of unconscious competence. That means things start reaching, if it's a positive skill, a level of mastery of sorts. Not in mastery, but rather in the sense of developing skill over a lifetime. So let's say over 10 or 12 years you have anger and you get really, really good at using it as a tool. But you also like the power that it gives you and you feel strong. And you like the intimidation factor. This is where we start looking at it being used instrumentally to make gains or to have things. Not that it's okay, but there's also a permutation of anger versus it being a natural outcropping of stress, environmental stress, or even feeling unsafe and feeling the need to protect oneself. So these are just some thoughts on anger that I just want to put out there, things that we need to think about. Now, what I'm going to tell you about that's coupled with this presentation on anger is going to be some ideas on body language, tonals, and the message that we speak. There's been much study done on this, and there are quite a few that vary on this percentage, but I'd stick to this percentage because it's just convenient for me. But the other breakdown in percentage isn't so huge in difference that would be inaccurate. But this is a working model, and it'll make sense of what we're talking about. Since language is one of the things that we use to communicate, we have to understand that anger makes us sensitive to an aspect of communication that is body language. When somebody starts acting or moving in a way that's maybe too abrupt, too twitchy, or starts indicating by their facial body language, not just their body, but the facial body language as well, that seems sincere and compelling, that may make me angry or feel threatened such that I'll respond in anger. Often I've heard people tell me that the way they talked to me, not what they said, but how they said it, the tones, was irritating or something that may have caused them to feel upset, angry, or even offended. The next part is the code or the message. The message didn't offend, but how they said it and how their body was responding while they were saying it were the more important parts. Now, the breakdown in percentage is that most messages that are spoken, the delivery system, that's our body and our voice, are what's most important to pay attention to, especially if we're upset or on the verge of getting upset or somebody's on the verge of getting upset with us. The influence of the message that is most impactful is the body language. We see that first. 50% of the influence of any message is body language, of the deliverer, of the speaker. 43% of the influence, that's almost 50% as well, is the tonal. What does it sound like? What does their voice sound like? Do they sound really abrupt? Do they sound angry? Do they sound aggressive? Is it really fast? Does it make me nervous? Or is it something that's mellifluous? Is it smooth? Does it sound a little more accommodating and less threatening? So 93% of any message is body language and tonal. What it looks like and what it sounds like. 7%, literally 7%, is what the message or the code of the message, the words that you're saying in quotes, you just won the lottery. 7% of the influence of the message are the words that are spoken. It's not so much what they said, it's how they said it. How did they say it? Well, that all depends. How were they looking when they were saying it? That's 93% of the influence or the impact of what messages we receive that may or may not determine whether or not we get offended or feel threatened. That could possibly result in our getting angry because we feel unsafe or insulted, this sort of thing. Now that's a lot in a little bit, but it's a lot to chew on, but these are some very actionable things that you can pay attention to. And we'll add more to it, and we'll sophisticate this method as we go for now. That's been anger. What happens with anger? Aspects of anger and things that most people don't discuss with anger. It's not just a matter of don't get mad. And for sure, it's not about deep breathing when you get angry, because that'll just make you more honked off and upset. But if you must do something that is uncomfortable, like staying where things may be irritating or uncomfortable, because of social contract, taking care of kiddos, or you're in a car and you can't go away, this is appropriate for the box breath, the square breath, the 4-count breath that I taught in episode 5. So that way you can work with that, whether you're standing, seated, or even laying down, but somewhere you feel comfortable. But if you're not able to get away to somewhere like that, you can do that, and it works in the middle of what it is you're experiencing, and whatever is happening is not nearly as irritating. So I'll give you some good practical tools to work with. to help transform how it is that you may experience and plug into what it is that we call upset and anger. And this also works with irritability too. But this is about self awareness. What happens to me? This isn't just looking out the windows, our eyes, and seeing someone else and saying, ha, that's you. Well, no. May as well look in the mirror and tell yourself that because it's human. And you may see it in others, but we also recognize it in ourselves. And I like to teach these tools in a way that we all can benefit. These are good things to be aware of and to teach your kiddos, not to tell them they're doing bad, but rather let them recognize what's going on and realize that there is a lot more control available to us in self regulation. So that way, things that are done don't necessarily have to result in shame, guilt, and upset or destructiveness or worse. So for now, I want to tell you thank you for spending time with me this evening and make good use of this. Share this with people. There are a lot of people out there. I'm sure you might know somebody that's a little upset, angry, or irritable that could benefit from this. Just don't tell them I told you that. But do take care. Really good talking to you, and we'll talk to you soon in the next episode. Have a good night.